Hello and welcome to Dogs with Torches. In this episode, we are joined with Dr. Lisa Fagin Davis to discuss the medieval provenance and historical significance of the famous and somewhat elusive Voynich manuscript. We'll be discussing the manuscript's contents, its historical provenance, its difficult to interpret script, and the manner in which the manuscript has received sort of popular and controversial acclaim regarding to its supposed contents. Dr. Davis received her PhD in medieval studies from Yale University in 1993. She has cataloged medieval manuscript collections at Yale University, the University of Pennsylvania, the Walters Art Museum, Wellesley College, the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, the Boston Public Library, and several private collections. Her publications include catalogues of medieval and Renaissance manuscripts, numerous articles in the field of manuscript studies and codicology, and of course, research on the Voynich manuscript. Dr. Davis, it's a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for joining with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
So yeah, I figured maybe we could just dive right into it, so to speak. What is the Voynich manuscript, and why has it gained so much sort of fame and acclaim?
So the Voynich manuscript is it's a real object. It's not some fantasy. People sometimes forget that. It belongs to Yale University. It's manuscript 408 at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale in New Haven, Connecticut. And it is has gained notoriety because it is written in a series of symbols that may or may not be an alphabet. We really don't know, that have completely defied interpretation. No one knows whether it is a code, whether it's just nonsense, a lost language. There are a lot of different options. And more than 100 years of study now, since it came to light in 1912, has really resulted in a lot of dead ends and a lot of argument. Once the manuscript became available through digital images online, that's when interest in the manuscript worldwide really began to take off, because now everyone could see it, everyone could throw their hats in the ring and start digging into it. And it is renowned. It is known across the world. There are probably thousands of people who are obsessed with it and think about it all the time, and people who have only encountered it in passing. But it really is a completely unique object. There's nothing like it. I've studied hundreds, thousands of medieval manuscripts over the course of my career, and there's nothing like it in the world that I've seen.
Mm, mm. And what can you tell us about the manuscript's ownership history? Who are the people that sort of owned or studied the manuscript? I know you mentioned that in the 20th century that studies sort of really took off, but as I understand it, the manuscript itself has a very colorful history of
Mhm.
ownership and fascination with the documentation.
Yeah, so it first enters the historic record in the late 16th century, so the late 1500s, when it is said to have been acquired by Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II at his court in Prague. Now, there isn't any secondary, actual evidence that this is true. It could just be a rumor. It's not part of his library catalog. There isn't any actual evidence that officially and without doubt associates this manuscript with the court of Rudolph II. We we think it was that he owned it because of a letter written 50, 60 years later by someone else who mentions that story. So it's just sort of secondhand knowledge. But we do know, we do have a series of owners in Prague in the 1600s. Um, Jacobus Tanapius, who then gave it to his friend Georg Barasch, who then bequeathed it to Athanasius, to Marcus Marci, Johannes Marcus Marci. And all three of these men were scientists and alchemists, investigators of the natural world in Prague in the 1600s. Marcus Marci then sent the manuscript to Rome as a gift to Athanasius Kircher in 1665. And Athanasius Kircher was an extremely well-known scholar, Jesuit, who had recently published a book on hieroglyphics, on Egyptian hieroglyphics. And so Marcus Marci, in the letter he wrote accompanying the gift of the manuscript, he said, I know that you can do it. You can figure this out, my dear Athanasius, because you understand mysterious script.
Hmm.
So he sends the book to Kircher, and we don't really know what Kircher thought of it. There really hasn't been any clear evidence of any correspondence from Kircher or publication or any mention of the manuscript. So we don't really know what Kircher thought about it.
Hmm.
But the manuscript stays in Rome in the hand of the Jesuits for several hundred years. It just sort of enters the library of the Jesuits in Rome, and it just stays there. And then in 1912, book dealer Wilfrid Voynich comes to Rome, and he is looking to acquire books and manuscripts for sale. And the Jesuit community was, in fact, about to sell off a bunch of books and manuscripts. So he acquires a big collection of books and manuscripts from the Jesuits, among which is the Voynich manuscript. Now that's the story. That's what we think happened. But we don't really know 100% for sure how Voynich got the manuscript, because there aren't any records, and Voynich never said where he got it.
Right.
And that's actually really typical for a bookseller in the early 20th century, to be kind of mysterious about where something came from. People often think that that's really suspicious, that Voynich wasn't willing to say where he got it. There are people who think, well, that means he must have forged it himself. He must have made it if he wasn't willing to say. But the truth is, it's very common in the book selling world to try and build up an air of mystery around something. And it's not at all surprising to me that he was not willing to specify where and how he acquired it. And then he brings it to the States in 1912. He brings it and tries to sell it. He travels around the country with the book, trying to market it to different rare book libraries and private collectors. And no one will buy it because it's so weird. And he's not willing to say where he got it. So people don't know if it's authentic or not.
Right.
And so he can't sell it. And after he died, he bequeathed it to his wife. He dies in 1931, I think. He bequeaths it to his wife, Ethel Voynich. She owns it for the rest of her life. And when she dies in 1960, I think, she bequeaths it to her assistant, Anne Nill. And Anne Nill then sells it for $24,500 to a New York bookseller named Hans Kraus. Kraus spends the next 7 years trying to sell it, and he can't sell it either. He's trying to market it for, $100,000 or something. I mean, just outrageous amounts of money, and no one will buy it. And so eventually he gives up and he gives it to Yale so that it can be studied at a university. And that's the end of the story. So we start in Prague, and over the course of 400, 500 years, make our way to New Haven, Connecticut, where the manuscript now sits in a vault in the basement under the library.
Right. That is really, really fascinating and colorful. So, and I liked what you said about how initially Voynich wasn't able to sell the document because people were sort of suspicious that it was a forgery, and we don't really know how he acquired it, because that was sort of a way that people would write off traditionally the manuscript, that it's so bizarre that it's just a forgery. But as I understand it, on account of the techniques of radiocarbon dating, there's a kind of estimate as to when the document actually came about historically. And have voynitologists been able to radiocarbon date the manuscript at all?
Okay, so the way that carbon-14 works is it doesn't tell you when someone picked up a pen and wrote on the pages. It tells you when the animal whose skin it is written on, because it's written on animal skin, on vellum or parchment, carbon 14 tells you when that animal was slaughtered, when it stopped growing, basically. And so that means we know that the parchment was sourced in the early 1400s. So the first quarter, say, of the 15th century. Is it possible that the parchment could sit around for hundreds of years empty, and then Wilfrid Voynich found it, the empty parchment, and decided to make this manuscript? It's possible, but it is extremely remotely possible, right? All things are possible, but they are not equally possible.
Mm.
So in this case, looking and honestly, that's part of the case, that there are people who are very strong believers that this is a forgery made by Wilfrid Voynich. I think that's almost impossible. I find that exceedingly unlikely.
Mm.
And that's because the manuscript itself has all of these other physical components. So it's not just the parchment, it's the ink, it's the pigment, it's the sewing threads, it's the binding, it's the stains, it's the signs of previous ownership. And the more of those features you pile on, the more likely it is that we're looking at an authentic 15th century object. It would be almost unimaginable that someone could convincingly forge all of those components in a way that did not rouse suspicion. And I've studied the manuscript in person at least 6 times, probably more, and I have never seen anything that makes me think it is anything other than an authentic 15th century object.
Okay, okay. And with regards to the manuscript's content, is there at all any evidence of palimpsest, or is it just an
No, there
original
really
work as
isn't.
okay.
No, there are signs of previous ownership that have been scraped away, and that can be read under ultraviolet light. And I wrote a blog post about that. If you go to my blog, you can find it. And it's the manuscript road trip. You'll see I wrote an entire blog post about some new multispectral imaging and the results of that investigation. But there is absolutely no sign that this is a palimpsest. It is definitely, it's the first time the parchment was used was to create this manuscript.
Okay. Okay. And as regards to the documents main physical characteristics, I know that you mentioned it was written on vellum, carbon dated to the 15th century.
Mhm.
With regards to its other characteristics, what kind of ink was used to make the manuscript? Does it use different pigments or colors?
Yeah, so the ink is an oak gall ink, which is totally consistent with 15th century practice. So they've done chemical analysis of the ink, the composition of the ink and the composition of the pigments, and there is nothing in those scientific analyses that is suspicious. So you cannot ever prove that something is authentic. You can only prove it isn't authentic.
Mm.
So if those analyses had concluded, say, that the parchment was from the 1900s,
Right.
obviously that would settle the question, or that the inks and pigments had modern chemical signatures, that would be enough to make a case that it is in fact a modern object. None of those happened. All of the results of the chemical and other scientific analyses are consistent with 15th century practice. So the pigments are either mineral or botanical, as they should be. They don't have any modern components. And the same is true for the ink. The ink is a sort of standard oak gall ink.
Gotcha. And I know nothing of this. Does the kind of does the kind of ink that was used tell us anything geographically of where it might have been?
Unfortunately, no.
Okay.
No, it's very generic. And the same
Okay.
is true for the pigments, unfortunately. The thing about medieval pigment, so say this doesn't necessarily use a lapis lazuli blue, but that's a nice example of how this works. So lapis lazuli is this beautiful, rich ultramarine blue pigment that is only found one place in the world, Afghanistan. So when they're using that pigment in England and France and all over the place. So there's evidence because of that of really lengthy trade over long distances during this period. So knowing where the pigment was sourced is not actually going to help us figure out where the manuscript came from because there's so much trade and so much movement of goods and people during this period.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Oh, okay. And
I mean, what would be great, and this is, for someday, you could do a DNA analysis of the calf skin. You could do that. And someday, if we have a large enough database of DNA samples from parchment of a known date already, in a known place, you might be able to say, this has the DNA signature of Italian cows, or this has the DNA signature of a cow in Central America, or whatever. That could be really helpful, but such a database does not exist. There's not enough, that kind of work on sort of ancient DNA studies is only now getting started. There's a project in England where they're looking at documents that have a known date and creating a database of DNA sequencing from that parchment. That's not going to be helpful for the Voynich manuscript until we have a truly enormous data set. So right now, that particular technique isn't going to be helpful.
sure, but maybe sometime in the future, if
Exactly.
it develops, okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Huh.
So it could happen, but we're not there yet.
Right. And okay. And then with respect to the actual script, the textual contents, what can you tell us about the manuscript's script itself? Has anyone been able to make any sort of deciphering efforts on any part of the script itself?
So there's a lot going on there. So the quote unquote alphabet, I'm just going to use the term alphabet, even though we don't know if that's what it is, but it's a set of symbols. All right. So we'll call it a glyph set. The glyph set is around 30 symbols, which is a kind of the Goldilocks zone for it not to be an alphabet, right? If it were 300 symbols, 300 different symbols, it's not going to be an alphabet, at least not one with a one-to-one correspondence.
Sure.
And if it were only 10 symbols, it couldn't be an alphabet, right? But we're at around 30, so it's not too big, not too small. So it is a controlled number of symbols. And those symbols have, there are rules that govern how they're used. There are some symbols that you almost always only find at the beginning of a word. Others you find only at the end. Some appear in particular combinations quite frequently, and other combinations are quite rare. So it does have, there are rules to Voynichese. Like if you made up something in Voynichese and showed it to me, I would be able to say, oh no, that's impossible. That's not authentic Voynichese because it breaks this rule and that rule.
Okay.
And so that's actually really helpful for linguists and cryptologists. If you have a series of rules you can work with, that could really help you understand what we're looking at. So, for example, you can look at which is the most common symbol, which is the least common symbol, right? Like if we knew that the manuscript was encoding English, which it isn't, but if we knew that it was, you would then say, well, the most common symbol in the Voynich manuscript must represent the letter E. And the least common symbol must represent the letter Z, because those are the most common and least common letters in English, in American English, at least. And so the fact that we don't know what the source language is makes it extremely difficult to decode. If we knew what we were decoding into, it would have been cracked decades ago. It would have been easy. If we knew it was Italian, that's easy, right? Because you know what the letter frequencies are in Italian. and 15th century Italian, and you could work from there. So that's one issue. Then there's a question of, is it a language at all? Does it represent a natural human language? Or is it a made up language like Elvish or Dothraki or something? Or is it just nonsense that has no meaning at all? And so linguists can dig into these questions by using, I mean, you can't type in Voynichese in a way that a computer is going to be able to analyze, right? Because they're not ASCII characters. So Voynichologists have developed a substitution, totally arbitrary. It's not at all semantic, it's arbitrary, where you take that symbol and we're going to pretend we're going to substitute that with the letter T. And for this symbol, we're going to use P. But those are not, remember, those have no meaning. They're just arbitrary. But it's a way to be able to input Voynichese and have an algorithm start analyzing it in terms of thinking about what are the rules, what are the frequencies, how can we analyze this to determine if it represents a language or not. And one of the ways linguists do this is by using something called Zipf's law, Z-I-P-F, Zipf's law, which states that in a naturally occurring human language, the most common word in that language will generally appear twice as often as the next one, which is twice as often as the next one, and so on. So you end up with this kind of inverted curve. And Voynichese follows that rule. When you look at the words, and we don't know that they're words, but I'm using scare quotes to use that as a convenient term. You look at the word frequencies in Voynichese, it follows Zipf's law perfectly, which is really a really cool outcome, because that does suggest that it represents a natural human language. On the other hand, there are other calculations that suggest something else is going on. So, for example, Voynichese is very predictable in terms of the sequence of letters, and it's more predictable than a natural language should be. So if you tell me a letter, I can almost always guess what letter is going to come next. In English, that's not true unless you have, it is with the letter Q. But other than that, if you give me one letter, I can't guess what the next letter, it's like Wordle, right? You just have one letter, it could be almost anything, right? But in Voynichese Wordle would be really easy. You would almost always get it in 2 or 3 guesses, because Voynichese has a very low entropy. It is very, very, very predictable. And it's not, and it shouldn't be. So those two observations almost contradict one another. And the linguists that I'm collaborating with are still puzzling that through, trying to figure out how can we resolve those two seemingly contradictory results.
Right. And if I may follow up on the subject of sort of made up languages, is there at all any precedent in kind of the medieval period of sort of individual persons or maybe even group projects formulating their own language? I mean, I know the only one off the top of my head I can think of is maybe the case of the 12th century Benedictine abbess Hildegard von Bingen, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there are certainly examples of mystics and visionaries who are speaking in tongues and making up languages. There are absolutely examples of that. There's a lot of encoding going on during this period among scientists, sort of trying to hide their work from the church officials or something. So it's not unprecedented to have a code or a secret language. That's that I wouldn't say it's common, but it certainly happens. But there are a lot of things about the Voynich that make it extremely unusual, even among those groups of objects. Its length. It's so it's 100 and maybe basically 100 folios or 200 sides, 200 pages. So it's a lot of text.
Right.
And the fact that it is written in that the illustrations are such that you can kind of divide it up into sections, and that's also unusual. There are lots of manuscripts where you have, two different texts or five different texts that have been brought together, but there are commonalities running through the Voynich manuscript, even as the sections appear to be visually quite different from one another. So it's just it's a very unusual and very interesting object. And when you look at the contents, shall we walk through the contents? We could do that too.
Absolutely,
Okay.
yes.
So, and I actually have here a facsimile of the manuscript
Oh, it's
that
beautiful.
that actually is the same, it's the right size. It's exactly, so you get a sense of the scale. It's basically as big as my head.
Oh, I love it.
It's like an 8x10 sheet of paper. It's not that big. And it's this facsimile actually reproduces the wormholes and the sewing structure. And it's almost like having the actual manuscript here. I could just go out on the deck and read the Voynich. It's lovely.
Awesome. Oh,
Yeah, it's really cool. And so it's a good way to sort of introduce you to the contents. So the first section are these plants that goes on for about 60 leaves. And the plants all have leaves and flowers and stems and roots, but they're, this one over here kind of looks like a water lily of some kind. There's another one that that looks like cannabis. There's one that looks like a sunflower. There are some that look familiar, but it's also almost impossible to say for sure what plant they represent, because they're not quite realistic enough. I don't know if the artist was terrible or if they don't represent real plants. They could just be making up things. Um, but it's one plant per page, and each plant has text accompanying it. And this is a common genre in the Middle Ages, an herbal or a botanical, because there's a lot of interest in what different plants are good for medicinally. And so I think that's probably what this is. So it's all of these plants, one per page, and then the text would say, here's the name of this plant, here's how you take care of it, and here's how you harvest it, and here's what you can use it for. That's probably what this is. The next section is where we get these really cool and also unusual foldouts. This is very unique in a medieval manuscript. I have never seen another manuscript that has anything like this, where the pages fold out into these longer sections.
Right.
And this and that is extremely unusual. I mean, I've just never seen anything like it. And this section has these sort of diagrams that I don't know what they are. Are they scientific?
Yeah.
I can't even imagine. And then you get these zodiac pages, where in the center you have different signs of the zodiac, very clearly identifiable, and in the Western zodiac tradition. So that's an important clue. It's unlikely that this is from China, for example,
Right.
because it's not a Chinese zodiac, it's a Western zodiac.
Right.
And surrounding the signs of the zodiac is where we meet our naked ladies in the bath, in these wicker baskets. This is where they make their first appearance, and they will recur all through the manuscript.
Okay.
So that's the next section. Then, but wait, there's more. Then we have my favorite part of the manuscript, which is when the naked ladies really have their heyday. So this whole section, every page has got these weird diagrams that look almost like they're, I don't know, biological. And then you've got the ladies in the bath, and that goes on and on for, I don't know, like maybe 17, 16 pages. And so look at this one. I love this one. At the top of this page, you've got what really looks like the female reproductive system. So there's a uterus, these are, ovaries, there are your fallopian tubes. That's what it looks like to me. I can't say for sure that that's what it is, but then you've got this, this poor lady sitting on a bladder of some kind, some internal organs. It really looks like this section has something to do with gynecology or obstetrics or women's health, especially because a lot of these ladies appear to be pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
And so is that what's going on? Maybe all we can do is try and interpret the illustrations. Then we have this really totally unprecedented, crazy thing, which is a huge fold out.
Oh, wow.
Of basically 6 sections that it's 9 circles interconnected on 6 segments of the page. It's a huge sheet of parchment, probably representing one whole animal skin, basically. Right. And this diagram, I couldn't possibly even begin to interpret. I have absolutely no idea what this could be. But if you look really closely up here, there's a little castle in this section in the upper right corner. And that castle has a really distinctive architectural feature called a swallowtail merlin. And those are used in fortress-like structures in northern Italy, southern Germany, and sort of scattered around other parts of southern Europe. So that's another clue about a potential origin of the manuscript. And then there are 2 more sections. We have this bit where it looks like we're taking components of different plants. You take this leaf and those flowers and those roots, and you combine them and put them in some kind of a vessel, and you get something, medicine, something. I don't know what. And then the very last section is just text like this. It's just paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs with a star at the beginning of each paragraph. So when you that's the contents. So it's basically sort of 6 different visual sections. And those coordinate with the physical segmenting of the manuscript, the sort of structure of the manuscript. And when you put all that together, plants, stars, zodiac, astronomy, biology, and these kind of recipes, it starts to feel like what we're looking at is some kind of a scientific or medical compendium where you have all of this information in one place for easy reference, maybe having to do with women's health and women's knowledge.
Okay.
But that's kind of as far as we can go just based on the visuals in the manuscript.
Okay. And so would it be right in inferring that it's likely that these illustrations are not merely decorative, like they're connected to the text perhaps, or?
I think that's probable.
Okay.
It's, again, until we can read the thing, we can't say for sure.
Okay.
Right. I mean, given the way that books generally work, it's likely that the illustrations relate to the text. That seems probable. And that's another way that linguists can attack this object, is by thinking about, well, are there particular words that are more common in this section than that section? So those words, is there a word that appears only in the botanical part of the manuscript that never occurs in the naked ladies in the bath part?
Right.
So that's another way that linguists are approaching this manuscript.
Okay. And you mentioned that the manuscript comprises of 6 sections. Is it do we understand, I mean, as far as we can tell, is the manuscript itself a complete manuscript? Is it partial? I mean, do we know anything in that area, or?
So the manuscript does have page numbers up there in the corner, but those are quite late. Those probably date from the 1600s. They're 17th century numbers. I can tell from the style of how the numbers are written. And so those numbers represent the manuscript in the sequence and the extent that it existed in the 1600s. What happened to it in the 200 years before that we have no way to know.
Right.
And if you, according to these numbers, there are actually some pages that have since gone missing. So for example, if we look, let's see, here we go. So here's page 11, or I should say folio 11. The next leaf says 13.
Okay.
So, and there's a little stub here. Even in the facsimile, they included the stub.
Nice.
That shows you that, in fact, a page has gone missing. I'd love to know where it is. And in fact, we also know that before Marcus Markey owned it, the owner before him, Georg Barasch, actually wrote a letter to Athanasius Kircher where he said, I'm sending you a page from this crazy manuscript. I'd love to know what you think. So it's possible that it was page 12 that he sent him.
Right.
Maybe. We just don't know.
Right.
And if so, where is page 12? Is it in an archive in Rome? Tell your listeners, everybody go to Rome and start puttering around the Jesuit archives and see if you can find this thing. I'm kidding, don't do that. Others have already done that and no one has found it.
Okay.
And there are, I believe, 12 pages that are missing.
12.
Is that right? More than that, but around, I think maybe like 14 or something pages that we know are missing.
Okay.
But it's possible that there was a lot more than that. There's no way to know, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, Dr. Davis, thank you so much for coming on. It may be unless you have anything else to mention or emphasize regarding the manuscript, maybe we could.
Yeah, let me say one more thing. So the work that I have done on the manuscript specifically is identifying how many different handwritings are in it.
Yeah.
How many different scribes actually held a pen and wrote on it. And I've identified 5 different handwritings in the manuscript. And that speaks also to a sort of collaborative and community of practice. 5 different people who knew how to write this script, 5 people who were recording this information, which also supports the idea that it represents something. You've got 5 people using this language in the same way, using basically the same rules. There were a few differences, which is also interesting. That it's a community of practice recording this information for their own purposes, I find really exciting.
Okay. So if it is the case that this is a fabricated, made up language, it's at least legible to those sets of people who were writing it or were maybe dictating it. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. Which is pretty cool too.
Right. No, yeah. Huh. All right. Well, maybe as a closing question, do you have any resource recommendations, book recommendations for those who'd want to learn more about the Voynich manuscript? I'll link your blog in the description.
Yeah. So this is the best book to start with. It's edited by Raymond Clemens. It's just called the Voynich Manuscript, and it's published by Yale University. So if you go to the Yale University website for the Voynich manuscript, it has its own nice little web page. You'll find a link to this book. It's very affordable. I think it's only about $45 US, which is quite inexpensive. It includes a complete photo facsimile of the manuscript, as well as a bunch of the essays on the latest research. So it's a really great introduction to the manuscript. Another really great resource is Renee Zandbergen's website, which is voynich.nu, which is really the best clearinghouse for all things Voynich, things that are vetted and reliable. If you just Google it, you'll end up God knows where. So you have to Google with care if you're looking into the Voynich manuscript.
Right. Oh, perfect. I'll be sure to link both of those in the description below. Perfect. I mean, right. Dr. Davis, it's a pleasure. It was a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Good luck. Good luck, everyone, in your own investigations.